The moment I saw those yellow bulldozers parked outside my disabled mother's cabin, I knew the HOA had finally crossed a line they couldn't uncross. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white as I watched three men in hard hats surveying her property like vultures circling roadkill. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I'd driven here for our usual Tuesday lunch, expecting to find Mom in her garden or reading on the porch swing I'd built for her arthritis-ravaged joints. Instead, I found her wheelchair pressed against the front window, tears streaming down her face as she watched strangers mark her trees for removal. The same trees Dad had planted before the cancer took him. The same oak where I'd carved my initials as a kid, dreaming of the day I'd be successful enough to take care of her properly. "They said I have until Friday," she whispered when I burst through the door, her voice shaking with the kind of defeat I hadn't heard since Dad's funeral. The HOA president, Mrs. Henderson, came by with some legal papers, said my cabin violates new community standards and has to be demolished for a neighborhood beautification project. My blood turned to ice water. This wasn't just about property violations or neighborhood politics. This was about a bunch of entitled board members trying to steal my mother's home while she was too disabled to fight back. They thought they could intimidate a 73-year-old woman in a wheelchair into abandoning the only place she'd ever called home. But here's what Mrs. Henderson and her precious HOA board didn't know about me. Here's the one crucial detail that was about to turn their little power trip into the biggest mistake of their privileged lives. As I stood there watching my mother cry over the home my father built with his own hands, I realized they'd just declared war on the wrong family. And I was about to show them exactly why you should never mess with someone's mother when you have no idea what their son does for a living. The construction crew was scheduled to begin demolition Monday morning. They had 4 days to destroy everything my parents had built together. What they didn't realize was that they'd just given me 4 days to destroy everything they'd built instead. I kissed my mother's forehead and promised her something I'd never said lightly in my entire adult life. "Mom, I swear to you on Dad's grave, they will not touch this house. Not one board, not one nail, not one flower in your garden." She looked up at me with those tired blue eyes that had seen too much loss, too much pain, and whispered, "But how can you stop them, sweetheart? They have lawyers and money and all those legal papers." I smiled for the first time since seeing those bulldozers because I finally had an answer that would make my father proud. Because sometimes, Mom, the universe, has a sense of humor. And sometimes, the people trying to destroy your life accidentally hire exactly the wrong person to do it.to understand why this moment changed everything. You need to know what this cabin means to my mother, and what my mother means to me. 3 years ago, Mom's rheumatoid arthritis progressed from manageable discomfort to complete disability. The woman, who used to dance in the kitchen while making Sunday dinners, now struggles to open a jar of pickles. The hands that taught me to throw a baseball can barely grip a coffee cup without shaking. But this cabin? This cabin is her sanctuary. Dad spent 2 years building it himself after they moved to this community, back when the HOA was just 3 retired couples who met once a month to discuss snow removal. Every board was measured by his hands. Every nail was driven with his love for her. The kitchen counters are exactly wheelchair height because he knew, even then, that her arthritis would get worse. The doorways are wider than standard because he refused to let her ever feel trapped in her own home. When Dad died 5 years ago, the mortgage company tried to foreclose. The medical bills had drained their savings, and Mom's disability checks barely covered groceries, let alone property taxes. That's when I made the decision that changed my life forever. I wasn't going to let her lose the only thing she had left of him. I was 28, working construction for other people, watching my bosses get rich while I made barely enough to cover my own rent. But I had something they didn't have: desperation mixed with purpose. I took every dollar I'd saved from my own house, borrowed against everything I owned, and bought out the mortgage on Mom's cabin. Then I mortgaged my soul to start my own construction company. The first 2 years nearly killed me. 18-hour days, bidding on jobs that barely covered costs, sleeping in my truck between sites because I couldn't afford both gas and a hotel room. I remember calling Mom from a job site in the middle of winter, my hands so cold I could barely dial her number, telling her I wasn't sure I could make it work. "You know what your father would say," she told me, her voice steady despite everything she was going through. "He'd say that the best things in life are worth breaking your back for. And I'm worth breaking your back for." She was right. By year 3, I had 15 employees. By year 5, I had 3 crews and was bidding on commercial projects. By year 7, I owned the largest independent construction company in the county, with contracts spanning 4 states and a reputation for taking on the jobs that other companies couldn't handle. Everything I built, every late night, every risk I took, every dollar I reinvested instead of spending on myself, it was all for her, to make sure she'd never have to worry about losing her home again. To make sure no one could ever make her feel small or helpless or forgotten. And now Mrs. Henderson and her HOA board thought they could walk into my mother's sanctuary with their legal papers and their bulldozers and just take it away? They thought they could make her cry in her wheelchair while they planned to destroy the last physical connection she had to the love of her life. They had no idea that every sledgehammer swing they planned to take at her walls would feel like a personal attack on everything I'd sacrificed to build. They didn't know that threatening her meant threatening the one person who gave me the strength to crawl out of poverty and build an empire. But they were about to learn that when you mess with a disabled woman's home, you better make damn sure her son isn't the kind of man who owns the equipment to fight back. Mrs. Henderson's house was exactly what I expected: a pristine McMansion with a circular driveway, perfectly manicured hedges, and a BMW that cost more than most people make in 2 years. I knocked on her door at 7 p.m., still in my work clothes, still carrying the rage that had been building since I saw my mother's tears. "I'm here about my mother's cabin," I said, keeping my voice level despite every instinct screaming at me to lose my temper. "The demolition order you served today." Her face shifted from annoyed to smugly satisfied. "Oh, you must be Patricia's son. I'm sorry, but the board's decision is final. Your mother's property is in direct violation of our new community standards, and frankly, it's been an eyesore for years. The cabin has to go." An eyesore. She called my father's legacy, my mother's sanctuary, the home I'd sacrificed everything to protect, an eyesore. "Mrs. Henderson, my mother is disabled. She's lived in that cabin for 15 years. Where exactly do you expect her to go?" She shrugged, like my mother's homelessness was a minor inconvenience. "There are assisted living facilities that specialize in her condition. This community is moving in a different direction, toward properties that maintain our property values. Your mother's situation is no longer compatible with our vision." I felt something inside me crack. Not break, crack. Like ice on a frozen lake, right before it gives way completely. "Our vision? You mean your profit margin when you sell her lot to developers?" Her smile turned razor sharp. "Young man, I suggest you review the HOA bylaws your mother signed when she moved here. We have every legal right to enforce community standards. If you have a problem with that, take it up with our attorneys, Morrison, Ketch, and Associates. I'm sure they'll be happy to explain property law to someone in your position." Someone in my position. There it was, the assumption that because I showed up in work boots and a flannel shirt, because my hands were calloused and my truck had mud on the tires, I must be some uneducated laborer who could be intimidated by fancy law firm names. What if I told you I could bring the cabin up to any standards you want? I asked. New siding, new roof, professional landscaping. Whatever it takes. She laughed. Actually laughed. With what money? Do you have any idea what that would cost? We're talking about a complete renovation, not some weekend DIY project. We need contractors, permits, professional work. This isn't something you can fix with a YouTube tutorial and a trip to Home Depot. The irony was so perfect it almost hurt. Here she was, telling me I couldn't afford professional contractors, while standing in front of a woman who was about to learn that sometimes the universe delivers justice with a construction helmet and a business license. And what if I refuse to let you tear it down? I asked. Her expression turned ice cold. Then you'll be in contempt of a legal order and we'll have you arrested for interfering with authorized demolition work. The construction crew starts Monday at 8 a.m. sharp. I suggest you use the weekend to help your mother pack. She started to close the door, but I put my hand against it. Not aggressively, just firmly enough to keep it open while I delivered the line that would haunt her dreams for months. Mrs. Henderson, let me ask you something. When you hired your construction crew for this demolition job, did you happen to check who owns the company? For the first time since opening the door, her confidence flickered. Just for a second, but I saw it. That flicker of doubt in Mrs. Henderson's eyes should have been my first warning that she was about to escalate this war beyond anything I'd anticipated. By Thursday morning, I realized I'd severely underestimated just how far a desperate HOA board would go to destroy my mother. I woke up to 17 missed calls and a text message that made my blood run cold. They're here again. More men with clipboards. They won't leave me alone. It was from Mom, sent at 6 a.m. I threw on clothes and drove to her cabin like my hair was on fire, breaking every speed limit between my apartment and her driveway. What I found was psychological warfare disguised as community service. 4 HOA board members had stationed themselves on my mother's property with measuring tapes, cameras, and official-looking forms. They were documenting every possible violation they could manufacture, from improper mailbox height to unauthorized garden modifications to non-compliant exterior paint color. Mom was trapped in her wheelchair on her own front porch, watching strangers crawl over her property like investigators at a crime scene. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her coffee cup. "What the hell do you people think you're doing?" I demanded, storming up to the group leader, a thin man in an expensive suit who looked like he'd never done physical labor in his life. "I'm James Morrison, HOA legal counsel," he said. Extending a business card like this was a social gathering. "We're conducting a comprehensive property inspection to document all existing violations before demolition begins Monday. You're terrorizing a disabled woman in her own home." He smiled with a kind of cold professionalism that probably cost $300 an hour. "We're following proper legal procedures. Your mother signed a binding HOA agreement that gives us full inspection rights. She's welcome to observe from inside her residence if the process makes her uncomfortable." Inside. He wanted her to hide inside her own home while they violated every inch of her property. "She has arthritis, you heartless bastard? It takes her 20 minutes to get from the porch to the living room." That sounds like a personal mobility issue, not a legal concern. That's when I realized this wasn't just about the cabin anymore. This was about breaking my mother's spirit so completely that she'd surrender without a fight. They were counting on her disability, her age, her isolation, to make her too exhausted and intimidated to resist. By Friday, they'd escalated to harassment that bordered on stalking. A noise compliance officer showed up at 7 a.m. to measure the excessive volume of Mom's morning news program. A landscape violation specialist spent 3 hours documenting the unauthorized native plants in her wildflower garden the same flowers Dad had planted from seeds they collected on their honeymoon. But the final straw came Friday evening when they served her with a health and safety citation for keeping her late husband's woodworking tools in the garage. According to their inspector, the tools constituted a hazardous materials storage violation and had to be removed immediately or face daily fines. Those tools hadn't been touched since Dad died. Mom kept them exactly as he'd left them, covered with his old canvas tarps, because walking into that garage and seeing his workbench made her feel like he was still there. It was the only place in the cabin where she could still smell his aftershave on those old work shirts he'd left hanging on nails. I found her in the garage that night, crying over Dad's hammer, like her heart was breaking all over again. "They want to take his tools away," she whispered. "It's like they want to erase every trace of him from this place." That's when I understood their real strategy. This wasn't about property values or community standards. This was about systematically destroying every connection Mom had to her old life, every memory that gave her strength, until surrender felt like relief. Saturday morning, I sat in my office staring at the contract that would destroy Mrs. Henderson's entire world. It was buried in a stack of demolition paperwork. My project manager had left for my weekend review, just another routine job for Davidson Construction Company. My company. The company I'd built from nothing to become the largest independent contractor in the county. The irony was so perfect, it felt orchestrated by divine intervention. Morrison, Ketch & Associates had hired my company to demolish my mother's cabin, and none of them had bothered to check who signed their paychecks. To them, I was just the construction guy, invisible, interchangeable, someone whose name wasn't worth remembering. But here's what 10 years of building a business empire had taught me. Information is power, and contracts are weapons when you know how to use them. I called my attorney, Sarah Chen, the shark who'd negotiated every major deal that built my company from a one-man operation into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. "Sarah, I need you at my office in an hour," I said. "Bring your contract law books and your appetite for blood. We're about to turn a demolition job into a war crimes tribunal." When she arrived, I spread the HOA demolition contract across my conference table like battle plans. "Tell me everything that's wrong with this agreement." Sarah's eyes lit up with the predatory gleam of a lawyer who'd just spotted wounded prey. She spent 45 minutes dissecting the contract with surgical precision, and what she found was better than I dared hope. "This is a goldmine of legal incompetence," she said, marking violations with red ink like a teacher grading a failing exam. "They hired your company for immediate demolition without proper environmental impact studies, without checking for historical preservation requirements, without confirming utility disconnections, and without validating their own legal authority to authorize demolition." What does that mean in plain English? It means they hired you to commit multiple felonies on their behalf, and you have documented proof that they knew the demolition was legally questionable. Look at this clause. They specifically indemnify your company against any legal challenges that may arise from property ownership disputes. I felt a smile creep across my face. They knew Mom might fight back. Better than that, they knew their legal authority was shaky, so they tried to make it your problem if everything went sideways. But here's the beautiful part. As the contracted demolition company, you have the legal right to refuse any job that violates local ordinances or puts your licensing at risk. The plan crystallized in my mind like ice forming on glass. So if I determine that this demolition violates county building codes, you're legally obligated to halt the project until all violations are resolved. And, as the property owner's son, you have standing to file formal complaints about every single code violation they've committed during their harassment campaign. I spent the rest of Saturday documenting everything. Every illegal inspection, every manufactured violation, every piece of harassment they'd inflicted on Mom over the past week. Sarah's paralegal team worked through the weekend, building a case file that read like a prosecution manual for HOA corruption. But the real masterstroke came Sunday evening, when I reviewed the demolition timeline and realized they'd made one final, fatal error. The contract specified that demolition would begin Monday morning at the discretion of the contracted demolition supervisor. That supervisor was me, and I had complete authority to modify the timeline based on site conditions and safety concerns. Monday morning, I arrived at Mom's cabin at 7 a.m. in my company truck, wearing my hard hat and safety vest, carrying a clipboard full of legal documents that would turn Mrs. Henderson's victory celebration into a funeral march. The HOA board was already there, along with their lawyer and a photographer they'd hired to document the destruction. Mrs. Henderson stood at the edge of Mom's property line, like a general watching enemy fortifications crumble. She had no idea she was about to watch her own empire collapse. Instead, exactly 8 a.m. Mrs. Henderson marched across Mom's lawn, like Napoleon approaching Waterloo, her expensive heels clicking against the flagstone path. Dad had laid by hand. She was flanked by 3 board members, her lawyer Morrison, and that smug photographer, all of them practically vibrating with anticipation. "Well," she demanded, stopping 3 feet from where I stood beside my bulldozer. "We're ready to begin. Where's your crew?" I looked up from my clipboard, meeting her eyes with the calm expression of a man holding 4 aces in a poker game where everyone else was betting their life savings. "Ma'am, I'm afraid there's been a complication with the demolition schedule." Her smile faltered just slightly. "What kind of complication?" "A legal one. As the contracted demolition supervisor, I've identified multiple code violations that prevent me from proceeding with this job." I flipped through my clipboard like I was reading a grocery list. Unauthorized utility modifications, improper environmental impact assessment, failure to obtain historic preservation clearance, and violation of county noise ordinances during preliminary site preparation. Morrison stepped forward, his briefcase clutched like a shield. "Those are technicalities. We have full legal authority from the HOA board to proceed with this demolition." "Actually, you don't." I pulled out a thick folder that Sarah had prepared, marked with official county seals and legal stamps. According to County Building Code 347.2, any demolition contractor who proceeds with a job that violates municipal ordinances can lose their license and face criminal charges for property destruction. Mrs. Henderson's face was turning an interesting shade of red. "Young man, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but we have a signed contract with your employer. You work for us." That's when I delivered the line I'd been rehearsing since Saturday night, the words that would detonate their entire world like a controlled explosion. "Actually, Mrs. Henderson, you work for me. I'm not just the demolition supervisor. I'm David Davidson, owner and CEO of Davidson Construction Company, the company you hired to destroy my mother's home." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear a lawnmower running 3 blocks away. Mrs. Henderson's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Morrison dropped his briefcase. The photographer actually lowered his camera. That's impossible," Mrs. Henderson stammered. "You're just some construction worker. You showed up at my house in work clothes." "I showed up at your house after working a 14-hour day building a shopping center that'll employ 300 people," I said, stepping closer until she had to crane her neck to meet my eyes. "The same way my father worked 14-hour days building this cabin for the woman he loved. The same way I've worked every day for 10 years building a company successful enough to tell entitled bullies like you to go straight to hell." Morrison finally found his voice. "This doesn't change anything. The contract is binding. You're legally obligated to complete this job." I smiled, pulling out the contract termination form Sarah had prepared. "Actually, I'm legally obligated to refuse any job that violates building codes or puts my licensing at risk. And since your HOA has spent the past week conducting illegal inspections, filing fraudulent violation reports, and harassing a disabled property owner, proceeding with this demolition would make me an accessory to multiple felonies. You can't do this, Mrs. Henderson said, her voice rising to just short of a shriek. We'll sue you for breach of contract. We'll destroy your business. We'll make sure you never work in this county again. With what? I asked, genuinely curious. The same legal team that hired me to demolish my own mother's house without checking my name on the contract? The same board that thinks construction worker means stupid and powerless. I gestured toward my bulldozer, my crew, and the equipment that could level their perfect little community if I wanted it to. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the moment when you realize that sometimes the person you're trying to crush owns all the hammers. The true beauty of destroying someone's world isn't in the initial explosion, it's in watching them scramble through the aftermath, trying to piece together their shattered power while everything they touch turns to dust. Mrs. Henderson and her board learned this lesson over the following weeks, as their attempted retaliation backfired in ways that would have been comical if they hadn't tried to destroy my disabled mother first. By Tuesday, Morrison was calling my office every hour, alternating between threats and desperate settlement offers. Mr. Davidson, perhaps we can reach an accommodation. The board is willing to withdraw the demolition order in exchange for your agreement not to pursue legal action. Counter offer, I told him during his 6th call that day. Your client, Mrs. Henderson, personally apologizes to my mother for 6 months later. I'm sitting on the front porch of my mother's cabin, watching her tend to the wildflower garden that Dad planted and I saved from destruction. The arthritis still slows her down, but there's something different in her movements now, a confidence that comes from knowing that no one can take this place away from her ever again. The settlement money from the HOA's insurance company paid for a complete accessibility renovation of the cabin. New ramps, a roll-in shower, kitchen modifications that let Mom cook the way she used to before the arthritis stole her independence. But more than that, it paid for something you can't put a price on, the knowledge that sometimes David really does beat Goliath, especially when David owns heavy machinery and knows how to read contracts. Mrs. Henderson resigned from the HOA board 3 days after the district attorney announced formal charges for elder abuse and disability discrimination. The last I heard, she'd moved to a different state where hopefully no one knows her reputation for trying to bulldoze disabled women's homes. The remaining board members issued a public apology to my mother and implemented new bylaws, specifically protecting residents from harassment and illegal inspections. But the real victory wasn't in their destruction. It was in what we built from the ashes of their arrogance. Mom's cabin has become a symbol in our community, featured in the local newspaper as an example of how families can stand together against institutional bullying. I've received calls from dozens of other families facing HOA harassment, and my law firm has started specializing in cases where powerful people try to crush the powerless. The irony that still makes me smile is how Mrs. Henderson's attempt to erase my father's legacy ended up immortalizing it instead. The cabin Dad built with his hands is now protected by historic preservation status. The garden where he planted seeds from their honeymoon is maintained by a volunteer group of community members who learned about Mom's story. The workshop where he kept his tools has been restored and is used by a local woodworking club that teaches disabled veterans carpentry skills. Sometimes I wonder what Dad would think about all this. I think he'd be proud that his son grew up to be the kind of man who could protect what he built. But mostly, I think he'd be amazed that the little boy who used to hand him nails while he worked on this cabin grew up to own the company with bulldozers big enough to level mountains. Here's what I've learned from this whole experience. Bullies count on you being powerless, isolated, and too overwhelmed to fight back. They prey on people like my mother because disability, age, and grief look like weakness to predators who've never faced real adversity. But what they don't understand is that sometimes the quiet person they're trying to destroy has spent years building exactly the kind of power needed to destroy them instead. The construction industry taught me that you can tear down anything if you have the right tools and enough patience. But it also taught me that the most satisfying projects aren't about destruction. They're about building something permanent that will outlast the people who tried to stop you. So if you're facing your own Mrs. Henderson, your own HOA board, your own group of bullies who think they can take what's precious to you, remember this. They're counting on you staying small, staying quiet, staying powerless. But sometimes, the person they're trying to crush has spent years building exactly the kind of strength they never saw coming. And if you found this story helpful, make sure to subscribe because I've got plenty more stories about people who thought they could destroy what I love. Spoiler alert, they were wrong every single time. Until next time, remember, never mess with someone's family unless you're absolutely sure they don't own bulldozers. Harassment, the entire board resigns, and you pay for the professional landscaping to repair the damage your inspectors caused to her garden. Otherwise, I'll see you in court, where I'll be seeking punitive damages for elder abuse, disability discrimination, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. He hung up. They chose the hard way. By Thursday, they'd escalated to the kind of desperate measures that people take when they realize they're drowning and start grabbing for anything that floats. Mrs. Henderson filed a complaint with the county licensing board, claiming I'd used my position as a contractor to manipulate legal proceedings for personal gain. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I arrived with Sarah and 3 boxes of evidence documenting every illegal action the HOA had taken. Mrs. Henderson arrived with Morrison and the kind of smug confidence that suggested she thought her connections would save her. The county licensing officer, a no-nonsense woman named Janet Rodriguez, who dealt with construction disputes for 20 years, listened to Mrs. Henderson's complaint with the patience of someone who'd heard every possible variation of this contractor didn't do what I wanted. "Let me understand this correctly," Rodriguez said, reviewing the case file. "You hired Mr. Davidson's company to demolish a property, then discovered after the fact that the property belongs to his mother?" "He failed to disclose a conflict of interest," Morrison argued. "He should have recused himself from the project immediately." Rodriguez looked at him like he'd just suggested that gravity was optional. "Counselor, are you arguing that a contractor should investigate the family relationships of every property owner before accepting a demolition job? Because that would be a fascinating new legal standard." That's when Sarah dropped the hammer that turned their complaint into their own indictment. "Your Honor, we'd like to submit evidence that demonstrates why Mr. Davidson was legally obligated to halt this demolition." She handed Rodriguez the folder containing photographs of every violation, every illegal inspection, every piece of harassment documentation we'd compiled. Rodriguez spent 15 minutes reviewing the evidence in silence, while Mrs. Henderson's confidence slowly drained from her face like air from a punctured tire. Finally, the licensing officer looked up with an expression that could have frozen hell. "Mrs. Henderson, in 20 years of handling contractor disputes, I have never seen such a clear-cut case of property owner harassment. Your board conducted illegal inspections, filed fraudulent violation reports, and attempted to coerce a disabled resident into abandoning her legal property rights. But the HOA bylaws clearly state," Morrison began. "The HOA bylaws don't supersede county building codes or federal disability rights laws," Rodriguez cut him off. "Mr. Davidson, not only was your decision to halt this demolition legally correct, it was legally required. Any contractor who proceeded with this job would have faced immediate license suspension." She turned back to Mrs. Henderson, with the kind of look that school principals reserve for children caught cheating on final exams. "Ma'am, I'm dismissing this complaint and referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of potential elder abuse and disability discrimination charges." Walking out of that hearing, watching Mrs. Henderson and Morrison huddle in panicked conversation while photographers from 3 local newspapers captured their humiliation, I realized that sometimes justice isn't about getting revenge. Sometimes it's about giving bullies exactly what they deserve. They had no idea they were about to learn the difference between breaking someone's spirit and awakening someone's fury.